The morning sun cast long shadows across Fort Benjamin Harrison as Colonel James Merritt adjusted his dress uniform one final time. His weathered fingers, which had served the military for 3 decades, smoothed down the row of medals that told stories of his sacrifices. At 62 years old, the colonel's face carried the lines of countless missions, but his steel-gray eyes remained sharp and alert. Today was different from the thousands of mornings before it. Instead of walking into his office as the respected head of military intelligence, he was heading to face a tribunal that would question everything he had built over his 30-year career. The military courthouse loomed before him, its red brick exterior suddenly feeling more like a prison than a place of justice. As he climbed the stone steps, Colonel Merritt noticed how other officers quickly looked away when they saw him. Just 3 weeks ago, these same people had saluted him with genuine respect. Inside the hearing room, the morning light filtered through tall windows, illuminating the polished wooden panels that lined the walls. 5 senior officers sat behind an elevated desk, their faces showing no emotion as Colonel Merritt took his place at the defendant's table. His military attorney, Captain Rodriguez, sat beside him, arranging papers with nervous energy. "All rise," the clerk announced, his voice echoing in the tense silence. General Howard Matthews, the head of the tribunal, looked down at Colonel Merritt with eyes that had grown cold since their last friendly golf game just 2 months ago. "Colonel James Richard Merritt, you stand accused of deliberately leaking classified information regarding Operation Silent Shield to civilian press. How do you plead?" "Not guilty, sir," Merritt replied, his voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions inside him. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, this former aide of 2 years, sat in the witness box. Her usual confident posture was gone, replaced by slightly hunched shoulders. She wouldn't meet his eyes as she began her testimony. "On April 15th, she stated, her voice barely above a whisper, "I observed Colonel Merritt making copies of classified documents related to Operation Silent Shield. Later that evening, I saw him meeting with Michael Drake, a war correspondent, at the Officers' Club." Colonel Merritt watched as she presented printed emails, security camera footage, and meeting logs. Each piece of evidence felt like another nail in his career's coffin, yet he knew something was terribly wrong. The emails shown on the screen looked like his, but he had never written them. The grainy security footage showed him entering the Officers' Club, but not the full story of why he was there. As Lieutenant Chen spoke, Merritt's mind wandered to his wife Catherine, who was sitting in the back row. Their eyes met briefly, and he saw the same strength that had supported him through multiple deployments. Next to her sat their son Thomas, home on break from West Point, his young face struggling to maintain military composure as he watched his father's reputation being dismantled. The evidence seemed overwhelming to anyone who didn't know the full story. But Colonel Merritt knew something else was happening here. The operation files in question contained more than just tactical information. They held proof of decisions that certain high-ranking officers wanted to keep buried forever. Captain Rodriguez presented their defense, pointing out inconsistencies in the digital timestamps and questioning the authenticity of the emails. But Merritt could see in General Matthews' eyes that minds were already made up. This wasn't a trial, it was theater. During a brief recess, Colonel Merritt stood by the courthouse window, watching young recruits march across the parade ground. Their synchronized steps reminded him of simpler days when right and wrong seemed clearly defined by the military code he had lived by. "They're going to make an example of you, sir," Captain Rodriguez said quietly, joining him at the window. "The pressure from above is intense. Someone wants this to stick." Colonel Merritt nodded slowly. "The truth has a way of surfacing, Captain. Sometimes it just needs time to float up through the mud." As they returned to their seats, Merritt noticed Lieutenant Chen's hands trembling as she shuffled her papers. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and he saw something he recognized from his years of interrogation experience: fear. Not the fear of being caught in a lie, but the fear of someone who was being forced to tell one. The morning session ended with more damaging testimony, but Colonel Merritt sat straight and proud. He had faced enemy fire, led men through impossible situations, and survived politics at the Pentagon. This battle would be different, but he would fight it with the same honor that had guided his entire career, even if that honor was now being questioned by the very institution he had served so faithfully. 3 days after the initial hearing, Colonel Merritt sat in his home office, surrounded by stacks of papers and old military files. The grandfather clock in the hallway struck midnight, but sleep wasn't an option. Not when his entire career hung by a thread. The investigation had taken an unexpected turn when Special Agent David Torres from the Criminal Investigation Division arrived at Fort Harrison. Unlike the tribunal members, Torres had a reputation for digging deeper than the surface. "Colonel," Torres said during their first meeting in a small interrogation room, "something about this case doesn't add up." He spread photographs across the metal table, surveillance pictures showing Lieutenant Chen meeting with unknown men in civilian clothes outside a diner 30 miles from the base. The pictures were dated just 2 weeks before she made her accusations against Colonel Merritt. In one photo, Chen looked distressed, almost frightened, as she spoke with a tall man whose face was partially hidden by a baseball cap. Meanwhile, Michael Drake, the war correspondent who had supposedly received classified information from Merritt, was conducting his own investigation. Drake had known the colonel for 15 years, since they first met during the Afghanistan deployment. He knew Merritt would never betray military secrets. James, Drake said during a careful phone conversation they both knew was probably monitored. "I'm looking into a private military contractor called Black Shield Solutions. The name keeps coming up when I ask questions about your case." Colonel Merritt remembered that name. Black Shield had been involved in a mission that went wrong in Afghanistan 3 years ago, a mission whose true details were buried in the files he had been accused of leaking. At home, Catherine Merritt noticed her husband growing more distant as he pieced together the puzzle. One evening, as she brought him coffee in his office, she spotted a name circled repeatedly in his notes: Major Gregory Hansen. Hansen was there that night in Afghanistan, Merritt explained to his wife, his voice heavy with realization. He was commanding the Black Shield unit when things went wrong. The official report blamed local militants. There was more to it. The next day, Special Agent Torres brought more disturbing information. Lieutenant Chen's bank records showed a large deposit made to her account 2 days before she filed charges against Colonel Merritt. The money had been routed through 3 different shell companies. "Someone's pulling strings," Torres said, tapping his finger on the bank statements. "And they're not doing a great job hiding their tracks, almost like they were in a hurry." Colonel Merritt's son Thomas, home from West Point for the weekend, helped his father organize the growing pile of evidence. As they worked, Thomas discovered something strange in the email timestamps. "Dad, look at this," he said, pointing to his laptop screen. "The metadata on these emails. They were all created within a 2-hour window, but they're supposedly from different days. Someone manufactured these in a hurry." The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A young IT specialist named Kevin Park approached Captain Rodriguez after hours. Park had been tasked with reviewing the base's security footage but found irregularities. "The footage of Colonel Merritt at the officers' club," Park explained, showing them his findings. "It's been edited. Look at the timestamp in the corner. It jumps 2 minutes ahead in one frame. Someone cut out part of the video." As the second week of the investigation progressed, more inconsistencies emerged. 3 other officers came forward, speaking quietly about pressure from above to support Chen's story. They described meetings where they were reminded about upcoming promotions and the importance of maintaining unit cohesion. Late one evening, as Colonel Merritt was leaving the base, he spotted Lieutenant Chen sitting alone in her car in the parking lot. She was crying. For a moment, he considered approaching her, but years of experience told him to wait. Someone had gotten to her, and pushing too hard now might make things worse. That night, as he shared his thoughts with Catherine, she said something that made him pause. "James, what if they chose Sarah because they knew you trusted her? What if they're using your own integrity against you?" The question hung in the air as Colonel Merritt stared at the wall of military photographs in his study. In one of them, taken 3 years ago, he stood with his unit in Afghanistan. In the background, barely noticeable, was a Black Shield helicopter. The same helicopter that would later be at the center of the incident, everyone wanted to keep buried. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was darker than anything Colonel Merritt had expected from the institution he had served so faithfully for 3 decades. The truth began unraveling on a rainy Tuesday morning, 3 weeks into the investigation. Colonel Merritt sat in a dimly lit coffee shop just off base, waiting for someone who had requested an urgent meeting. The message had come through Michael Drake. "Someone wants to talk. They say they know what really happened in Afghanistan." At exactly 9:15 a.m., a man in a worn leather jacket slipped into the booth across from Merritt. John Martinez, a former Black Shield helicopter pilot, looked over his shoulder before speaking. "What they're doing to you isn't right, Colonel," Martinez said, his hands wrapped tightly around his coffee cup. "I was there that night in Afghanistan. I saw everything." Martinez's story confirmed what Merritt had suspected. The friendly fire incident hadn't been an accident. Black Shield operatives had deliberately targeted what they thought was an enemy position, but it turned out to be a U.S. Army patrol. The cover-up that followed involved millions of dollars and several high-ranking officers. Back at Fort Harrison, Lieutenant Chen was beginning to crack under the pressure. Special Agent Torres noticed her unusual behavior during a routine follow-up interview. Her hands shook as she tried to maintain her story about Colonel Merritt's supposed betrayal. "Lieutenant," Torres said gently, "we know about the threats against your family. We can protect them." Chen's eyes widened. Nobody was supposed to know about that. The men who had approached her 3 weeks ago had made it clear. Either she helped frame Colonel Merritt, or her younger sister's college scholarship would mysteriously disappear. Then there were the photos they showed her of her parents' house, taken at night, suggesting they were being watched. Meanwhile, Catherine Merritt made a crucial discovery while organizing her husband's old files. She found a thumb drive hidden in a false bottom of his deployment memorabilia box. The drive contained backup copies of the original Afghanistan incident reports, documents that hadn't been altered. "James," she called her husband immediately, "I found something you need to see." As Colonel Merritt reviewed the files that evening, his son Thomas noticed a familiar name, Major Gregory Hansen. But it wasn't just Hansen's involvement that caught their attention. The documents showed a complex money trail leading from Black Shield to several offshore accounts belonging to senior military officials. Michael Drake's investigation had also struck gold. He had located a former Black Shield accountant who was willing to talk. The accountant had records of massive payments made to silence witnesses of the Afghanistan incident. More importantly, he had proof that the same people were now orchestrating Colonel Merritt's downfall. Lieutenant Chen finally broke down during a late-night meeting with Special Agent Torres. In a recorded statement, she revealed how Major Hansen and his associates had orchestrated the entire scheme. They had chosen her because of her computer skills and access to Colonel Merritt's office. "They made me plant false evidence on his computer," she confessed, wiping tears from her eyes. They had everything planned. The fake emails, the edited security footage, even the timing of the accusations. They knew Colonel Merritt had copies of the real Afghanistan report somewhere. They needed to discredit him before he could come forward. The next morning, as Colonel Merritt prepared for another day of the investigation, he received an unexpected visitor at his home. Captain Rodriguez arrived with urgent news. Someone had broken into the base's computer center overnight. The intruders had tried to delete all records related to the case, but they had made a crucial mistake. They didn't know about the backup servers, Rodriguez explained, a hint of triumph in his voice. "We have everything." The deletions actually triggered an automatic security protocol. Every file they tried to erase was immediately flagged and saved. But just as things seemed to be turning in Merritt's favor, his phone rang. It was Michael Drake, and his voice was tense. "They got to Martinez," Drake said grimly. "He was found in his apartment an hour ago. They're calling it a heart attack. But..." Colonel Merritt set down the phone, his face grave. Catherine, who had been listening, touched his arm gently. "It's not just about clearing your name anymore, is it?" she asked quietly. "No," Merritt replied, staring at the wall of military photographs that had witnessed his 30 years of service. "It's about making sure Martinez didn't die for nothing. It's about showing that the truth matters more than power." The black SUVs parked outside Colonel Merritt's house belonged to the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. Inside the lead vehicle sat Helen Parker, a senior investigator known for her unshakable integrity. Her arrival marked a dramatic turn in the case. "Colonel," Parker said as she sat in his living room, her gray suit as crisp as her manner, "what we're dealing with here goes beyond a simple leak investigation. Martinez's death changed everything." Catherine served coffee while memorizing faces. 27 years as a military wife had taught her to notice details. She saw how 2 of Parker's agents kept touching their earpieces, listening to updates about something happening elsewhere. At Fort Harrison, chaos erupted that same morning. Major Hansen had arrived at his office to find it sealed by military police. When he tried to access his computer remotely from another terminal, he discovered his codes had been revoked. Lieutenant Chen sat in a secure room at the Criminal Investigation Division, providing a detailed statement to Special Agent Torres. Her hands still shook, but her voice grew stronger with each revelation. They created a special unit, she explained, called Project Cleanup. Its real purpose was to hide what happened in Afghanistan. Major Hansen led it, but he got his orders from someone much higher up. Meanwhile, Thomas Merritt skipped his classes at West Point to help Michael Drake analyze the documents from the thumb drive his mother had found. Working from a hotel room in Washington, D.C., they discovered something that made their blood run cold. "Dad," Thomas called his father, his voice urgent. The Afghanistan incident wasn't an isolated event. We found records of 3 other covered-up friendly fire incidents involving Black Shield. They've been doing this for years. Back at the Merritt home, Inspector Parker received a call that made her normally composed face show concern. Martinez's autopsy report had come in. A heart attack showed traces of a nearly undetectable poison, one commonly used by intelligence agencies. "Your family needs protection," Parker told Colonel Merritt. "We're moving you to a safe house tonight. All of you." Catherine quickly packed essential items while Colonel Merritt copied crucial files. As they prepared to leave, their neighbor Mrs. Wilson called. She had seen 2 men in a blue van photographing their house earlier that day. The safe house was an ordinary-looking suburban home 30 miles from the base. As they settled in, Catherine noticed how the strain was affecting her husband. His face had aged years in just weeks, but his eyes retained their determination. That evening, Special Agent Torres brought more news. Lieutenant Chen's sister had been approached by 2 men claiming to be college administrators. They had tried to pressure her into calling Sarah, but campus security had intervened. "They're getting desperate," Torres observed. "Making mistakes." Inspector Parker set up a command center in the safe house basement. Screens showed surveillance feeds, document scans, and a growing network of connections linking Black Shield to various military officials. Around midnight, Michael Drake called with a breakthrough. "We found the money trail," he said. Black Shield wasn't just a contractor. It was a front company owned by 3 senior Pentagon officials. One of them is General Marcus Wright. Colonel Merritt sat heavily in his chair. General Wright was the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, and the same man who had pushed hardest for the investigation against him. The next morning brought another shock. Major Hansen was found dead in his car outside his apartment. Unlike Martinez's carefully disguised murder, this was clearly meant to send a message. A USB drive was left on Hansen's chest, containing a single video file. Inspector Parker played the video on a secure laptop. It showed Hansen recording a confession, his face tense with fear. "If you're watching this," Hansen's recorded image said, "I'm already dead. What I'm about to tell you about Project Cleanup and General Wright will explain everything. Colonel Merritt is innocent. He's being framed because he's the only one with enough integrity to expose the truth." As the video played, Catherine held her husband's hand. Thomas stood behind them, his young face showing the harsh reality of how power could corrupt the institution he had dreamed of serving. Outside the safe house, more government vehicles arrived. Inspector Parker's phone buzzed constantly with updates. The case was no longer about one colonel's honor. It had become a battle for the soul of the military itself. Colonel Merritt looked at the concerned faces around him and knew that the next 24 hours would determine not just his fate, but the fate of everyone involved in exposing the truth. The question was, how many more people would die before the truth finally came to light? Dawn broke over the safe house as Inspector Parker's team reviewed Major Hansen's confession video for the 5th time. The recording revealed something they had missed in earlier viewings. A reflection in Hansen's glasses showed someone else was in the room when he made the confession. Colonel Merritt, who hadn't slept all night, noticed it first. "Freeze the frame," he said, pointing to the tiny reflection. "Enhance that corner." The tech specialist zoomed in on the image. Though blurry, they could make out a familiar face. Colonel Robert Wilson, General Wright's chief of staff. The same man who had signed off on the original investigation against Merritt. Meanwhile, Michael Drake worked his contacts in Washington. At 7:15 a.m., he sent an encrypted message to Inspector Parker. "Found Black Shield's real office. It's hidden inside a law firm in Georgetown." Building security cameras show General Wright visiting late at night, always on Thursdays. Catherine Merritt, who had been quietly observing everything, remembered something important. "James," she said, touching her husband's arm, "remember that charity dinner 3 years ago? General Wright was upset when you mentioned reviewing old mission reports from Afghanistan." The memory clicked into place. That dinner had been 2 weeks before the accusations against Colonel Merritt began. Wright had seemed unusually interested in which old files Merritt planned to examine. At Fort Harrison, Special Agent Torres interviewed Lieutenant Chen again. This time, she revealed a crucial detail about the fake emails used to frame Colonel Merritt. They had a template, she explained, her voice steadier now. They'd used it before, to discredit other officers who got too close. "I saw a folder with at least 5 other cases." Thomas Merritt, working with Drake in Washington, found records of these other officers. All had stellar careers until suddenly facing similar accusations. All had been investigating missions involving Black Shield. It was a pattern, Thomas told his father over a secure line. Every time someone got close to exposing Black Shield's operations, they were either discredited or died in accidents. Around noon, Inspector Parker received an urgent call. The FBI had raided Black Shield's secret office in Georgetown. They found shredded documents, but more importantly, they discovered a hidden safe. Inside the safe was a laptop containing encrypted files. The tech team worked frantically to break the encryption. When they finally succeeded, what they found stunned everyone. "It's all here," Parker said, spreading the printouts on the safe house dining table. Bank transfers, mission reports, blackmail material. They weren't just covering up friendly fire incidents. They were orchestrating them to eliminate people who might expose other operations. Colonel Wilson, aware that the net was closing, tried to flee the country. Airport security stopped him before he could board a private plane to Mexico. In his briefcase, they found more evidence, including photos of Martinez's murder. Catherine watched the news of Wilson's arrest on the safe house television. Beside her, Colonel Merritt studied Hansen's confession video again, looking for more clues they might have missed. Suddenly, Thomas called with another breakthrough. "Dad, we found something in the Black Shield files. They're planning something big. There's a list of targets, officers who were getting close to the truth. You're not the only one they're after." As if to confirm Thomas's warning, Special Agent Torres rushed into the safe house. "We just intercepted communications," he said breathlessly. "They're moving to eliminate everyone who knows about Project Cleanup. Tonight." Inspector Parker immediately activated emergency protocols. Teams were dispatched to protect potential targets. Lieutenant Chen and her family were moved to a different safe house. In the basement command center, they watched as multiple surveillance feeds showed black SUVs moving across the city. The people behind the conspiracy were making their final move. Colonel Merritt stood before the evidence wall they created, photos and documents connected by red strings. Everything pointed to General Wright, but something still didn't feel right. "We're missing something," he said, studying the patterns. "Wright isn't the top. He's covering for someone else." Catherine joined him at the wall, her eyes finding a photo they'd overlooked. In it, taken at a military ceremony 2 years ago, stood a familiar figure behind General Wright, the Secretary of Defense himself. "James," she whispered, "look who signed off on every Black Shield contract." The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. The conspiracy went higher than anyone had imagined. As night fell, Colonel Merritt and Inspector Parker realized they weren't just fighting corrupt officers anymore. They were up against the highest levels of military and civilian leadership. And somewhere in Washington, the Secretary of Defense was calling an emergency meeting. The Secretary of Defense's emergency meeting turned into chaos when FBI agents burst into the Pentagon conference room at exactly 9:00 p.m. They carried warrant papers and boxes of evidence from the Black Shield raids. Meanwhile, Colonel Merritt and Inspector Parker raced toward Fort Harrison. They had received an urgent message from Lieutenant Chen. She had escaped her safe house after discovering one of her security guards making suspicious phone calls. "She's hiding in the old records building," Special Agent Torres reported through the secure radio. "But she says she has something everyone needs to see. Something she didn't tell us before." Rain pounded against the armored SUV's windows as they drove through the dark. Catherine Merritt, watching from the Safe House Command Center via video link, noticed unusual movement on the base security cameras. "James, She warned through the radio, "There are 3 unmarked vans entering the base from different directions. They're not following normal security protocols." Colonel Merritt recognized the pattern. It was a standard military containment formation. Someone was preparing to surround the records building. Inside the old building, Lieutenant Chen waited in a basement storage room, clutching a small red laptop. Her hands trembled as she typed, accessing hidden files she had secretly copied months ago. "I should have told you everything from the start," she said when Merritt and Parker found her. "But I was afraid. These files don't just show what happened in Afghanistan. They show every operation Black Shield ran for the past 10 years. As Chen opened the files, they heard footsteps above them. The building's security cameras showed armed men in black tactical gear moving through the corridors. "They're not military," Parker observed, noting their non-standard movement patterns. "Black Shield contractors." Thomas Merritt, still working with Michael Drake in Washington, managed to hack into the base's communication system. Through their earpieces, they could hear the contractors coordinating their search. "We have 5 minutes, maybe less," Merritt said, watching the laptop screen as Chen transferred files to a secure drive. The files revealed something even more shocking than they expected. Black Shield wasn't just covering up accidents, they were deliberately creating situations that required cover-ups. Each incident allowed them to blackmail more officials, growing their network of influence within the military and government. "It's a power grab," Chen explained quickly. "They're building a shadow command structure. The Secretary of Defense is just their latest puppet. They have dirt on everyone." Suddenly, the power went out. Emergency lights cast eerie red shadows as footsteps approached their location. Inspector Parker drew her weapon while Colonel Merritt and Chen finished the file transfer. Through their earpieces, they heard Thomas's voice. "Dad, we got the files. Frake is broadcasting them to every major news outlet right now. It's too late for them to stop it." The storage room door burst open, but instead of Black Shield contractors, General Wright himself stood there, flanked by military police. "It's over, James," Wright said, looking oddly relieved. "I'm here to surrender." The general's face showed the strain of years of blackmail and compromise. He explained how Black Shield had trapped him, using his own mistakes to force his cooperation. Each time he followed their orders, they demanded more. "I'm tired of being their puppet," Wright said, handing over his sidearm. "The Secretary of Defense ordered me to eliminate everyone in this room. Instead, I brought witnesses." The military police with him were actually part of a loyal unit that had been gathering evidence against Black Shield for months. Wright had been secretly helping them, waiting for the right moment to turn. Above them, they heard gunfire. The Black Shield contractors had engaged with base security forces, but they were now trapped between military police units. Colonel Merritt's phone buzzed with a message from Catherine. News channels were already breaking the story. The Black Shield files revealed corruption reaching into Congress, defense contractors, and foreign governments. Lieutenant Chen's laptop kept transmitting data, exposing years of carefully hidden crimes. Names, dates, bank accounts, everything was now public. "You were the bait, James," Wright explained wearily. "They were so focused on silencing you, they didn't notice us gathering evidence against them. Your stubbornness bought us time to build a case that went all the way to the top." As dawn approached, military police led a handcuffed Secretary of Defense out of the Pentagon. FBI teams raided offices across Washington. The shadow network was crumbling. But in the old records building, Colonel Merritt knew the night wasn't over yet. Somewhere in the darkness, Black Shield's real leaders were watching their empire fall. And cornered predators were the most dangerous kind. The sun rose over Fort Harrison as military police secured the base. But the real battle was just beginning in Washington, where the exposed Black Shield files had set off a political earthquake. Colonel Merritt watched the chaos unfold on multiple news channels in the base's command center. 6 senators implicated, Michael Drake reported through a secure video call. 15 high-ranking military officers arrested. The Secretary of Defense is singing like a bird to federal prosecutors, but we still haven't found Black Shield's true leader. Catherine rushed into the command center, holding her tablet. "James, look at this," she said, showing him a series of old photographs she found in their family albums. "Remember that defense contractor conference 5 years ago? Look who's in the background of every major meeting." The photos showed a man they all knew, Richard Conway, a seemingly mid-level Pentagon bureaucrat who had worked in the Department of Defense for 30 years. In every picture, he stood quietly in the background, watching, listening. He was hiding in plain sight, Lieutenant Chen said, studying the images. Conway processed all the paperwork for Black Shield's contracts. He had access to everything. Special Agent Torres burst into the room. Conway's gone, he announced. His house is empty. We found his personal laptop, and our tech team just cracked it. You need to see this. The laptop revealed Conway's master plan. Black Shield wasn't just about money or covering up accidents. It was about controlling military policy. Conway had spent decades building a network of compromised officials, all to influence where and how America fought its wars. He was selling our military strategies to the highest bidder, Inspector Parker realized, scanning the files. Foreign governments paid him to know which regions we'd protect, which conflicts we'd enter. Suddenly, Thomas called from Washington. "Dad, Conway's just been spotted. He's at Reagan National Airport, but he's not trying to flee. He's called a press conference." Colonel Merritt understood immediately. He's going to try to spin this his way, paint himself as a whistleblower exposing corruption. "Not if I can help it," General Wright said, entering the room. Despite his earlier surrender, he was still wearing his uniform. "I've got 30 years of dirt on Conway. If he wants to play this game, I'll tell everyone how he really built his empire." Within an hour, they gathered at Reagan National Airport. Conway stood at a podium before a crowd of reporters, his bland bureaucrat's face now animated with fake sincerity. But before he could speak, General Wright stepped forward. "Mr. Conway," Wright called out, his voice carrying across the terminal, "would you like to explain Project Midnight to these reporters? Or should I?" Conway's face twitched. Project Midnight had been his first operation, the one that started his blackmail empire. Wright had been there, had seen how Conway orchestrated a friendly fire incident to gain leverage over a young general. "You're finished, right?" Conway sneered. "You really think anyone will believe a disgraced general over me? I have proof of your involvement in everything." "Yes, you do?" Wright agreed calmly. "Just like I kept proof of yours." He nodded to Thomas Merritt, who stood nearby with a laptop. On every screen in the airport terminal, including the ones behind Conway's podium, videos began playing. 30 years of secret recordings showed Conway building his criminal empire, blackmailing officials, and orchestrating military disasters for profit. Conway reached inside his jacket, but Colonel Merritt was faster. In one smooth motion, he tackled Conway as airport security swarmed in. The gun Conway had hidden fell to the floor, skittering away harmlessly. "This is how you want to end your career, Richard?" Merritt asked, holding Conway down. "Trying to shoot your way out in front of 100 cameras." As security led Conway away in handcuffs, Lieutenant Chen approached Colonel Merritt with tears in her eyes. "Sir, I'm so sorry for my part in all this. I should have trusted you from the start." Merritt looked at the young officer, seeing the same integrity he'd always valued in his own career. "You did the right thing in the end, Lieutenant. That's what matters." The reporters swarmed around them, shoving questions, but Inspector Parker held them back. This wasn't over yet. Conway might be arrested, but his network was vast. Some of his allies were still out there, watching, waiting. General Wright approached Colonel Merritt. "The Secretary of the Army wants to see you immediately," he said. "It's about restoring your rank and honors." But Merritt's eyes were on the airport security cameras. Something about Conway's smile as they led him away bothered him. The man didn't look defeated. He looked like someone who still had one last card to play. 1 month after Conway's arrest, Colonel James Merritt stood in front of a military review board. The same room where his nightmare had begun now held a very different atmosphere. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the faces of officers who had gathered to restore his honor. But Conway's final card was about to be played. Just as the Secretary of the Army began reading the official reinstatement, Michael Drake burst into the room. "Stop everything," he shouted, waving his phone. "Conway just released something. It's all over the internet." On screens across the country, a pre-recorded video showed Conway sitting in an expensive office. "If you're watching this," he said calmly, "I'm either dead or in custody. But Colonel Merritt isn't as innocent as everyone thinks." The video showed doctored footage of Merritt supposedly taking bribes years ago. Conway had spent decades creating this false evidence, saving it for the perfect moment to destroy Merritt's reputation forever. Catherine, sitting in the front row, grabbed her son's hand. Thomas was already typing frantically on his laptop, analyzing the video. "It's fake," he announced. "But it's the best fake I've ever seen. They used deep fake technology from 5 different angles." Lieutenant Chen stepped forward. "Sir," she addressed the Secretary of the Army, "I can prove these videos are false." During her time working for Conway, she had discovered his secret digital studio where he manufactured evidence against his enemies. Special Agent Torres rushed in with more news. Conway was found dead in his cell 10 minutes ago, but he sent copies of these videos to every major news outlet with documents that seemed to prove their authenticity. Colonel Merritt stood calmly as chows erupted around him. After everything he'd been through, he had expected one final attack. Conway was too clever to not have a backup plan. "Let me handle this," Merritt said quietly. He walked to the podium, facing the cameras that had gathered to record his reinstatement. The world was watching, ready to believe Conway's lies. 30 years ago, Merritt began, "I made a promise to serve with honor. Not for glory, not for power, but because it was right." He paused, looking at his family. "Conway spent decades building lies. I spent decades building trust." As he spoke, Catherine opened an old box she had brought with her. Inside were hundreds of letters, commendations, and photographs, evidence of a life lived with integrity. "My husband kept everything," she told the board. "Every mission report, every letter from soldiers he served with. 30 years of truth against Conway's lies." Thomas and Michael Drake worked quickly, comparing timestamps on Conway's video with proven records of where Merritt had been on those dates. The fake footage fell apart under scrutiny. Lieutenant Chen provided the final proof. She had secretly copied the software logs from Conway's digital studio, showing exactly when and how the fake videos were created. Conway's last attack failed, Inspector Parker announced, reviewing the evidence. He tried to destroy a good man's reputation from beyond the grave, but he couldn't fake 30 years of integrity. The Secretary of the Army stood up. "Colonel James Merritt," he declared, "in light of your extraordinary service and unwavering integrity, you are hereby restored to full rank and honors. Furthermore, in recognition of your courage in exposing this conspiracy, you are promoted to the rank of Brigadier General." Applause filled the room, but Merritt raised his hand for silence. "Sir," he said, "before you finish, there's something we need to discuss. Conway's network included foreign agents. They're still out there, still a threat to our military's integrity." "That's why we need you, General Merritt," the Secretary replied. "We're forming a new task force to root out corruption in military contracts. We want you to lead it." Merritt looked at his family. Catherine nodded proudly. Thomas stood straight, already thinking about how his computer skills could help the task force. Lieutenant Chen stepped forward, volunteering to join the team. "Truth isn't just about exposing lies," Merritt told the room. "It's about making sure those lies can never take root again." As he pinned on his new general's stars, Merritt thought about the cost of integrity. Friends had died, careers had been ruined, and families had suffered, but in the end, truth had prevailed. Outside Fort Harrison, the sun set on a changed military. Conway's network was exposed, his allies were being arrested across the globe, and a new era of accountability was beginning. General James Merritt walked out of the building with his family, his honor not just restored but strengthened by fire. The next chapter of his service was beginning, not seeking glory or power, but ensuring that honor and truth remained the foundation of military service.